I haven't been an organ donor for majority of my life. Granted, I didn't get ID till I was like 18, so that's part of it. But I was asked a few months ago why I was not an organ donor. I couldn't give a reason. I couldn't give a reason because ultimately what I think Tim and I will prove to you at the end of the day is there's never not a reason to be willing to save another human life. And that's what I think we're going to prove. So this motion that we support is that this House would require all citizens to be organ donors. And now the criterion, or sort of the weighing mechanism of this round, is we believe that whichever side saves the most lives win. Why do we think that should be the criterion? It should be the criterion because we think life is the highest end in all of our pursuits. We think we even value things like money, property, liberty. Why? Because it helps human life. And we think that we save lives not at the cost of a single human life. So let's talk about the idea how we think this will be implemented if we propose such a policy. So we think we propose a policy similar to what Finland has, which is what they call an opt-out system for organ donation. So what this means is that everyone will be required to be an organ donor. And if they don't want to be an organ donor, then they opt out after the fact. Currently, most countries have an opt-in system that does not require people to be an organ donor. But even if the opposition team comes up and says, we have to support a world where everyone has to be an organ donor regardless of their preference, we should still win this round, and we're going to prove the reasons why later on. So with that in mind, take a look at the first point. The first point is that we think that you're always obligated to be willing to save a human life. So right now, we do not have enough organ donors. People have been waiting for organs for transplants, and they're dying as they wait. The opposition team might come up and say it's good that people have a choice whether they should donate or not. What we would contend, though, is that there are times when we're talking about something as important as human life that you must use even coercive or compulsory measures to save human life. So where do we see, what are the reasons why? The first reason is that if you can do something to save a human life, you're obligated to save that life. All citizens, we think, are obligated to have. So it's not the idea that you should have the liberty to save someone else's life, or it's a good thing to do, but we think it should be something you're required to do. So if you watch someone die, and you can stop them from dying, we think, and you don't do anything, we think you're just as complicit as someone who murders them in the first place. We think that's a very basic Christian ethical theory, that you have when you can help someone, you should be required to help someone. So let's look at the second point, though. The second point, reason why we say you're obligated is because we think that the dead do not have individual rights. So when we're talking about organ donors, we're talking about post-mortem organ donors, not some creepy live harvesting thing. So when we're talking about this, we're talking, we don't think that you have an individual right after you're dead. So like, we're fine with personal liberty, but we're not fine with personal liberty when it comes at the cost of human life. That's why we're also anti-abortion. That's why we're pro-required organ donation. So what do we think? Well, we think that we're not concerned with the rights of the dead. We're a lot more concerned with helping the living, so there are less dead people. So if that means requiring people to be organ donors to save lives, we're fine with that. Fine even trampling on some person's even personal liberty to do so. The final reason, though, is we already have legal precedent for this. The governments coerce all the time. They take things away to preserve human life. We do this with taxes. We take taxes so we can have welfare services that save human life. We provide for our military to save human life. We do this with a draft like we had in World War II to protect the lives of our citizens. We coerce people, make things compulsory, and we save human life. So to make people who are already dead compulsory and giving up their organs to save human life, I think, is a perfectly legitimate and legal thing and is not at all incompatible with American liberty. Let's look at the second point, though. The second point is that there's no compelling reason not to be an organ donor. And why is that the case? Well, we don't see a very compelling scientific reason. Like, you're already dead. It's not going to hurt you. And we're not like in an Egyptian society where you need to get, like in ancient Egypt, where you need to get on to like the hereafter, right, with your body intact. You know, we don't buy that anymore. Furthermore, though, we would say that since it's directly saving a life, we think any objection that people have outweighs. Most objections tend to just be very non-specific, that they don't like the idea of their body being tampered with. They think it's gross, or oftentimes they just don't know about it, so they choose not to do it and get around to it. So making this a system where everyone's required to be an organ donor will just bring more people into actually becoming organ donors. It makes that thing that's active in society. We don't really see a compelling reason not to. In particular though, when you compare it to the benefits that you'll get. So this brings me to my third and final point, that voting government saves human life. So we think that with our policy, we're going to be making being an organ donor become the norm rather than the exception. So why is this the case, and why is it so compelling that we have to do this? Well, first of all, though, is the fact that we just need more organ donors. There are not enough as it is. In America, we have a 20% participation rate that cannot provide for a country with the amount of people that we have. We have people waiting in hospital beds, dying in hospital beds, waiting for a new lung or waiting for a new heart. Secondly, though, we say the current system disproportionately hurts the poor. Because we have so few organ donors, the poor people cannot afford an organ transplant. Since there's so few organs due to supply and demand, they just simply cost more money. I did learn something from microeconomics. So, I took my notes, Dr. Benson. But furthermore, though, what we contend is that we're talking about something very substantial and very real. We saw Finland adopted the policy that we're proposing, requiring everyone to be organ donor. What happened? The number of operations of transplants, such as we're talking about, rose by 60%. We saw a lot more lives saved in Finland. We're talking about substantial, real human lives. We're talking about someone who needs a kidney if they're not going to live a painful life on dialysis, which gives them a 50-50 shot at living. We're talking about a poor kid in a neighborhood in Queens who needs a lung transplant, otherwise he's going to die. We're talking about a grandfather, a grandmother who needs a new heart so they can spend 10, 15, 20 more years with their grandkids and maybe even their great-grandkids. That's what we're talking about when we're proposing that all people should be required to be organ donors. Those people I'm talking about, thousands of people that we're talking about, they're waiting. Many of them will die, and they need help. And they're not getting it, Mr. Speaker. They're not getting it with the current policy. That's why we're proposing the plan today. When someone is going to die, when human life, the highest and the greatest gift God ever gave to man, that's on the line. And we can do something to help. I don't think we should just try to help or promote the idea that most people should help. I think all of us must help, that we're demanded to help, and we will help if you vote government. Thank you.
I think Jonah showed us that wasn't necessary, so let's move it out of the way.
Johnny.
Oh, sorry. Yes, other people want to hear this too. Thank you. Is that good? Killing me here. Good? All right, there we go. Ready? Thanks for everyone for coming out today. Apologize in advance. I'm a little sick, so apologize in advance. If I have to wipe my nose or anything, it's a little gross. But anyways, so our side government came up here and said that there's never not a reason to save another human life. They said there's absolutely no reason that we could give that could contend against saving another human life. He said lives are the ultimate goal, so requiring us to go ahead and have to give our organs is just a step in saving human lives. Well, I'd like to ask a simple question of where does that end? If it goes as far as requiring us to give up our organs, so does that mean that when I eat too much, if I decide to have dessert, should I not do that because that isn't putting the ultimate end as human life? Because if I didn't eat that dessert and spent the $5 on donating it to a child starving in Africa, is that what I should do? Does every goal, does every act that I make have to have the ultimate goal of human life? Because if we want to say that, then there's a lot of things the government could require us to do. They could inhibit our ability to purchase anything that's superfluous to what we need. Do we need to be living in huts and saving all the money that we have and giving it to people starving in other countries? Because that would be putting human life first. So I just don't understand if we all of a sudden say that we can require absolutely anything to save human life and start here by requiring you to give your organs. I just don't understand why that's going to end, and I think that they have to prove that today. So I also want to move on to some of the other points that they make. I already talked about them, being obligated to save a life, and I said that, so if I do something like I mentioned, having dessert, or really anything that I could have done to give to somebody else, does that make me a murderer? Because that's basically what they're equating it to. They're saying if you don't give your organs, you're a murderer. I don't believe that. because I think it's their job to prove that the government is allowed to require us to do things like this to put human lives as our ultimate end in everything that we do, and I just disagree with that fundamentally, and so does my partner. They also said that we have, legal precedent for this. We have, things like welfare, military to protect human life. But again, I'd like to just make the point that that's fundamentally different. That's taking a portion of, maybe our taxes, and sometimes it is requiring us to, maybe enter the military. But that's not making a blanket statement such as this and requiring all citizens. I'd like to point that out. I think a really key word today is the fact that it's all citizens. They said that you're allowed to opt out of it, but that's not what the motion says. The motion says this House would require all citizens to be organ donors. So I'd just like to point that out. I don't know if you can necessarily change that as you'd like. Not now. So they brought up the example of Finland. Finland apparently implemented this system, and they said that it raised their participation rates, right? Okay, well, I'd also like to point out the fact that Finland is not the same as the United States of America. They have a much different governmental system than we do. They don't protect individuals' rights. They have a larger government. They're okay with taxing at much higher rates than we are. They have a much larger government that impedes their personal lives much more than we do here in the United States. And so I'm asking, here in the United States, is this kind of law going to open us up to other laws such as they have in Finland? So now I'd like to just kind of move on to my partner and I's points on the opposition side. They said that a dead person has no rights. They said that you cease having rights when you die. Yes, he did say that. And I just want to point out the fact that we don't recognize this in our legal precedent right now. For example, I can't just go out to a grave and dig up someone's body. That would be illegal. That person's life still is protected, even though they're dead. So we don't say that dead people don't have any rights, because we have this understanding that we do have rights as individuals. Yes?
So it's not quite the idea that dead people have no individual rights, but why should the rights of a dead person's body be valued above someone else's life that could be saved if they're an organ donor?
That's a great question. That's a great question, and let me tell you why. I'm actually going to use a story. So last December, my uncle passed away, and it was very sad, but he had a seizure and he was brain dead. And so the family had to come to the decision to basically pull him off of life support, right? So this is obviously a difficult decision that some of you may have faced. And when the family finally decided to take him off of life support, after they made that very difficult decision, the doctor came in and said, okay, here's the situation. You've told us that you want to pull him off of life support, which obviously when you make that decision, you kind of want to get it over with. You don't want it to be a long, drawn-out process. And he said, well, here's the deal. Your uncle's an organ donor, and before we're allowed to extract his organs, we have to find people to match with all of his organs before we can do that. And so this process took about 3 days. And my uncle was basically just sitting there on life support while his family had to wait with him to die for another 3 days and watch him before they finally found enough people to take his organs, which we later found out they only used one of them, a kidney, which they could have used from a living person, which we'll talk about that later. And anyways, they came in, pulled the plug. The family wasn't allowed to be there with him. They took him out because they have to extract the organs immediately. That's how organ donation works, is if you're dead for more than, I believe it's 10 or 15 minutes, they're not able to use those organs any longer. So it can my point is, it can put the family in a very difficult emotional situation at the end, in these end-of-life situations like I've just described with my uncle. And so I don't think that it's to say that there's only good that can come out of organ donation. This created a very difficult emotional situation that my uncle's daughters are going to have to live with the rest of their lives. And yes, while they might come up here and say, oh, but won't they have the satisfaction that his organs went to a good cause? Like I mentioned, it doesn't always mean that they use all of your organs. There's a lot of stipulations behind that. We can't just automatically assume there will all of a sudden be this like oversupply of organs. And my partner and I would like to point out the fact that there is only a 20% participation rate, and there are things that we can do to help try and increase that, but it doesn't need to be government mandated. There's things like running ad campaigns, talking about how great it is that we have the opportunity to give our organs to save other lives. But like I said, that needs to be the individual's choice, not the government's. And again, where would this end? what if a family had religious objections to having their bodies used for organ donation? Because, like I said, this is a deeply personal debate, and we ultimately think that it comes down to the individual and their family. It's the individual's choice to make whether or not they want to give their organs. And if it doesn't come down to the individual in like an end-of-life situation, we believe that it should go to their family, who knows this person deeply, not the government being a third party coming from outside and mandating it on the family. So we think that's a very important that's a very important point to make. And just lastly, again, I'd like to reiterate the fact that they have the proof is on them, and they have to show that they must require all citizens. I just have trouble giving that over to the government, all citizens, letting them mandate something so broad. I just don't see them having that right in my interpretation of what America stands for, what our Constitution stands for, and ultimately what we stand for as individuals. So thank you very much.
Sorry, my paper's in order. All right, speaker ready? We good on volume, by the way? Fantastic. So there's actually an old story that Abraham Lincoln liked to tell to people. So there was a farmer, and he had a large flock of sheep. And one day, while pursuing his flock, he walked up and he saw that there was a wolf entering into the pen. The wolf walked up to the sheep, and the farmer, being a good farmer, walked up, grabbed the wolf by the neck, and started pulling him out of the pen. And the wolf looked at him and said, "But sir, you are violating my liberty. What me and Jonah are giving you today is that sometimes your liberty and your autonomy can be outweighed by the potential benefits of violating those things, right? And we think that the marginal harms of violating the autonomy of those people who are already dead are far outweighed by the actual substantive benefits that we get for those people who are already living." So, 4 points of rebuttal before I get into my actual case here, in which I'll talk about the idea of autonomy and why that it's okay to override autonomy insofar as we do get benefits. So, number one, he talks about the slippery slope, and he's asked the question, what is the standard, right? So I would actually reply that Jonah did a very good job at explaining our standard. So what is it? Well, we're trying to maximize human benefit, and that entails also trying to minimize as much harm as possible. So what does this mean? It means we exclusively get organ donations from people who are dead, right? I'm sorry that you didn't get to eat cheesecake, Johnny, and I would like to have a world in which you do get to eat cheesecake for dessert every day, right? Because we think that to take that cheesecake away from you does harm you in a very severe emotional way, right? And we wouldn't want to have that outside government. So we do think that there's a bright line there, and we do think that we are fine on that bright line. But number two, though, so the second point of rebuttal is the problem he says that the problem is all citizens, right? And that we tried to fight us on our model point on the idea that we should have a point in which they cannot opt out, right? So number one, I just don't think that they did a good enough job of explaining why it didn't really fit within the wording of the model, aside from just the fact that he didn't like it. But second of all, even if we were to remove the opt-out system, even if we were to make it mandatory, we think that it's fine, right? Why is this? Because we think that autonomy is ultimately weighed out by the social good that comes, right? And even if Jonah and I have to operate on pure utility, we think that this utility is much better than any esoteric, any effervescent, any kind of hard-to-grasp notion of kind of autonomy or liberty or just isn't right. Third point, he talks about why Finland is a bad example because Finland be different. So I'm going to reply that, look, even if Finland is different and they're doing something good that happens to be different, then that is a problem on ourselves, not on the problem on Finland, right? And I think that we as a country are a country of immigrants who adopt culture, who adopt practice, who adopt government standards that ultimately work out for the best, right? I'm sad to say that Johnny doesn't want to move forward in the future, that Johnny cannot accept anything that might be good because it's just different, right? I just don't buy that as a really good argument. Finally, he talks about life support shenanigans, right? And he tells this very moving story about this man who had to stay on life support while they tried to find organ donations. Two responses to this. So A, I think that's just a call to have better storage procedures so we can harvest the organs directly, keep them on storage, find the patients afterwards, right? I think that was just like a dumb hospital policy. It wasn't really intended to hurt anybody. But B, even if we have to keep with the model that he gave to us, right? We think that the sadness of the family having to undergo 3 days of their uncle being on life support is far outweighed by the joy of a family who got their uncle back. The joy of a family who had their grandmother back. The joy of someone who found out that he's not going to die because he does get a kidney. The joy of someone who finds out that his heart will continue beating because someone gave him a new one. I think that those things far outweigh any possible harm that they've given us today. So let's talk about the issue of autonomy, right? So why do we think that it just shouldn't apply as a principle, or even if it does apply, it's outweighed by the principle of utility? So number one, we just think that the dead have less rights, right? We think that you lose ownership of your kidneys when you pass away. Why is this, right? Because I think that the assumption is over ownership of anything when you die, that it has to be passed on, right? That's the reason why dead people don't get to own estates into perpetuity. They have to give it on to their heir, right? And we're fine with allowing provisions that you can earmark your kidneys for your son or daughter if they need kidneys, right? But we do think, though, is that there's this assumption that you do need to pass on vital utility things, right? That you need to pass on things that could benefit somebody else. We think that organs are fully in this. And we don't think that it's in the same kind of realm of kind of defilement that like exhuming corpses and like, ripping them apart is, right? We think that rather we can, if we treat as a society as a sacred, sacrosanct thing, right? As one that's full of dignity and honor, one that aids people's lives, one that at the end of the day allows people to live just a little bit longer. We think that that's, if anything, honoring the body, honoring the power that the body has, honoring the power that the body can have for others. Second point, though, is the living have more rights and value, right? So we say that, just number A, the right to life, right? We think that that's something that only the living possess, and the dead don't have that, right? So we think that when the dead try to exercise their rights of ownership, they violate the right to life that the living have, right? They in turn directly kill someone by hogging selfishly their organs. We think that that is incredibly problematic. But second of all, though, and if we're going to go with a utility framework, we need to understand that the living just offer more utility than a dead body ever could, right? So what is this? So A, in kind of the more economic productivity aspect, right? So the living work jobs, the living help other people who are living, the living kind of, like make society run. But we think that it goes beyond that, though, because we think that there's a little bit more nuance here, because the living offer utility in terms of the emotional benefit they give, right? Because I would say that knowing that my grandmother was still alive and that she could go to my wedding is far better than knowing that my grandmother happened to have all of her parts when she was put in the casket, right? We think that the effect that the living have on society far outweigh any memory that the dead could ever give. So it's because of this that with the living matter more and should be preserved more than the wholesomeness of the dead, right? And we're fine even if it is some modicum amount of defilement, if it does mean that the living can continue onwards, right? And if it also means that nobody is hurt in the process, because we just don't think that the emotional harms that Johnny has mentioned far outweigh any of the good harms we've mentioned, and we just don't think that anyone's actually incurring physical pain because we're only taking them from the dead. But let's also talk about religious minorities, right? Because Johnny does mention this. I think it's important to talk about, right? We just don't think it outweighs. Why is this, right? So number one, we just usurp harmful religious beliefs all the time, right? Like this isn't like this new thing that we're introducing. So for example, we don't allow Native Americans to smoke peyote, right? And second of all, we don't allow Muslims to stone adulterous wives, right? We think that there are certain religious beliefs that because they are harmful, because they directly hurt other people, we're allowed to violate them because we think that it's for the good of the state and good of the people, right? In the same way, religious beliefs that dictate that you selfishly hog your organs, we think do directly hurt people, right? We think it's the equivalent of standing by when people are marched off to Auschwitz because you could have done something, you could have said something, you could have helped someone, but you didn't because it was more comfortable for you. Then we'd say that even if they aren't directly harmful, right, we think that the social good outweighs any harm that we do have to these religious minorities, right? We think that the social good of allowing people to live longer, not just a couple people, right, a vast amount of people. If you had looked at the numbers of people who are waiting for organs like lungs or livers or kidneys or hearts, you would be appalled. One person dies every 14 minutes for lack of an organ. We think that that is an overwhelming harm that they do have to address. But we think that all of these reasons are moot because we do still think that our model allows it. So if somebody is so religiously convicted that they cannot come to bear this, we think that they can opt out, right? But we don't think that that's a huge issue. So let's take a second and just look at the worlds we've constructed for you, right? Let's talk about government's world. This is a world in which three things are happening. So number one, that people are living and that they don't die, right? This means that more fathers get to walk their daughters down the aisle. This means that more mothers get to see their grandchildren. This means that more people get to live and love and enjoy this wonderful blessing that we call life. Number two, though, we think that everyone gets access, right? Because it's not just the people living in the suburbs who get organs now, right? Who living in nice high-rise penthouse apartments who get organs now, who can afford to fly to Nepal or Bhutan and buy organs, right? It's people living in Oakland, in Detroit, in the inner cities of the Bronx, right? People who have just as much right to live and just as much access, and should have just as much access to organs that now have it because they have far more supply. And then finally, we think we're reducing the moral hazard. Because by not donating, you're standing idly by while others die, right? And even if we have to compulse people to be morally good, we're fine with that, right? Because we think that the moral harms that are far too pernicious to allow. So we think that the moral good the social good and the utility good is on our side. And we think that opposition has to do a better job. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out. Hope this is a profitable debate. I'd first like to go by rebutting some points made by sad government and then go along and adding on to some of Johnny's points. Now, sad government's points all had one thing in common, one really correlating fact, and that it's un-American. It's un-American because there's something fundamentally repulsive about the idea of having the right to someone else's body, someone else's property. It's simply just un-American. Now, they make the argument that your liberty can be outweighed by the living, right? So the liberty of a dead person, the liberty of a dead person's body can be outweighed by the living's needs. And this just simply has no legal precedent. I mean, my goodness, we live in an age where a woman can abort a fetus because she has the fundamental right to her body. And whether we agree with that or not, what does this mean to someone saying you have the right to someone else's kidney? So yeah, their argument is just simply very progressive. They say that it's more utility, more social good. And there's simply just nothing legally protecting that in the Constitution or simply in society. Where do we see this play out? How does this look long term? Not now. And furthermore, Tim pointed out that you have the religious right to smoke peyote, which isn't true. That actually got struck down. You don't have the religious right to smoke peyote. No, gentlemen. Yeah, so their argument is simply that the dead have no legally recognizable rights. So, as Johnny pointed out, why is grave digging illegal? Why is necrophilia illegal? Now, certainly that's a more crass example, but it simply points out that the dead do have certain rights that can't be violated, even though they're dead. So, yeah.
So if you object to things like abortion, like you're talking about in rebuttal, then why do you like the idea of protecting people's choice to endanger and cost the lives of others?
Because protecting people's choices is what America does. Now, this isn't protecting the life of a fetus. We're not talking about that. The abortion example was simply to point out that legally we recognize someone's autonomy to their body, even after death, and that's just how it's been in America. We have a locking consensus that it's repulsed by any type of government in Finland. That's why we've never adopted anything social or anything progressive, is because it's inherently un-American. It doesn't appeal to the American spirit or the fundamental ideas of life, liberty, and property. Your liberty and your property are something fundamental to you, and they can't be taken away, especially by government coercion. Now, they talk about how the government is still able to coerce you to do these things. And how does that exactly play out? Legally, is there any actual precedent for them to be able to do this, and what does this mean? Now, going off of Johnny's points, he pointed out, where does this end? What else are they able to do if they're able to mandate what you do with your kidneys? It seems like a very slippery slope, getting rid of personal liberty for someone else's right. Now, he talked about life support. What does this mean for someone who has to be on life support for 4 or 5 more days? We're not even guaranteed that someone's going to get a kidney. What does this mean for grandma or for a baby? There's scenarios where, you don't always use the kidneys, but you're still desecrating their body and, violating their fundamental right to their property and their liberty for the potential of something that may not even occur. No. Now, this is what we like to propose. It's simply just more advertising. Get the word out. We need to, love is a mandate in the Bible. And this is simply by taking away choice, you're getting rid of the love aspect. You're getting rid of the genuine aspect of what it means to give and to protect someone else's life. If you don't have that choice, then there's really no love in it. There's no, mandate to save someone else's life by giving your kidneys. Yeah.
So for a long time, slavery was considered an American institution. Why should something's level of Americanness be an indicator of its moral goodness?
I think slavery is the basic example of hypocrisy against America's fundamental rights to liberty and property. I think slavery is a terrible example because it points against anything America's ever stood for. I completely agree that slavery is a sham, but I don't think that was a reflection of America's true founding principles. So simply put, our argument is this, that it's just not in the scope of government powers to mandate that you give away some of your property for someone else's life. It has not been, and it never will be, because it's simply un-American. We're not Finland. We don't have a progressive government that would like to violate on your rights. This is just how we do things. So simply put, we need to just get the word out. It means, spreading the word about, the benefits of giving away your kidneys, or the benefits of saving lives. But that doesn't mean taking someone else's body parts, by force. Making someone do that. So yeah, again, they say the moral good and the social good are on our side. And they bring up a fair point that millions of people, thousands of people, I guess, are dying because they don't get the support that they need. And that's a very sad fact about American life. But are you willing to overturn fundamental principles that America was founded on because of this? Now, granted, it's a sad reality that we're faced with, but we believe that there are other options. We believe that there are other ways. At least, if anything, give the family a choice. So let's say I was an organ donor and I die, and you ask the family. Yeah, you can give the family a choice because they're related to you, but by forcing it, it's just not right. It's just not, coercion has just never been the way that we do things, and you're just overturning years of case precedent. There is no precedent for this motion. So ultimately, it goes down to the fact that the moral good and the social good aren't outweighed by the dead and by the dead's right to their body, because the life of liberty and property are something fundamental. It's something America was founded on, and it's something America will continue to be founded on. And a motion such as this will simply get rid of that and lead to a slippery slope of the government can coerce you to do anything. Thank you.
Okay, so in my speech today, I'm going to address a couple points of rebuttal, rebuild some of our points, and then kind of give you an idea of exactly what this debate ultimately comes down to and why I believe you should side with the opposition. So Tim came up here and made the point that the living have a greater impact than the dead, and that my example of, the emotional, negative emotional impact, on my cousins is insignificant. But I think this is just something that's just simply not true in reality. I mean, we have plenty of examples of emotional impacts having very serious and real negative impacts on people. I mean, look at things like depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, all these kinds of different emotional illnesses, or in some cases things being caused from a traumatic experience that do have real impacts on people's lives. So I don't think it's fair to just dismiss that so easily. He also brings up the example that one person dies every 14 minutes due to a lack of enough organs in the country. And while, of course, my partner and I have given you examples of how we would like to, increase that number and say that, one person only dies every 30 minutes, we don't necessarily see the link where just because we want to increase that number, that automatically gives the government the right to our fundamental right of our body. Because we think there are alternative ways to increase that number. We think that you can run successful ad campaigns to show the benefits of donating your organs. You can show, the positive impact that you can have on somebody by opting in to be an organ donor and having the chance to save a life. But that's another thing I want to point out. Notice that I said you have a chance to save a life. It doesn't guarantee that you're going to save a life. In the example I gave you of my uncle, they only took his kidney. They're seeming to make this argument that by being an organ donor, you're automatically saving more lives, and they're going to use every organ that you have, when that simply is just not true. They also made this argument that poor people will get more organs. And I would like to just ask how that's proven, because I still don't see the poor people moving up the list as priority for getting more organs. I think that there are a lot of people without organs. Obviously, we have a shortage. But that doesn't mean that just because we have some more organs that poor people are going to be moved up the list. That just means that more probably people from affluent areas are going to be receiving organs, with poor people still remaining at the bottom of the list. So I don't think that's a valid argument either, not at this time. He also used this pretty strong language in saying that, if you're not doing something to save someone's life, it's the equivalent of walking by at Auschwitz while they're ushered into the mustard gas chambers. And this is kind of the example I'd like to go back to that I was mentioning before in my prior speech. He kind of made fun of my cheesecake example, which obviously this is an extreme example, okay? I was kind of trying to be a little bit funny, so I appreciate Tim pointing that out. But seriously, I think this is a question that we have to ask. If we're willing to give them our most fundamental right, the right to our bodies, then what else are we willing to give them up for the end goal being saving human life? He mentioned the fact that, he said that dead people don't have any say in what they do with their property when they die. That's not true. We have wills. We have estates. We absolutely, even when we die, are able to direct where our money goes. So if I'm a wealthy person and I die, should the government be able to take 100% of my estate and give it to starving children in Africa? That's a question we have to ask, because I think that it's my property that I accumulated over my lifetime, and I have a choice of where to send it, not the government. He also brought up the slavery example, which my partner did a good job of talking about, but I just want to bring that up again. Again, that was something that was different because slavery was violating the slaves' fundamental rights. So we would have rejected that. Of course we would have rejected that. That's violating their fundamental rights. We're rejecting this because we don't want our fundamental rights to be impeded on. So I'll take a question on that.
So do you think, therefore, that your bodily autonomy allows you to will the death of another?
See, I think that's just trying to use really strong language. Again, they're trying to bridge that gap of saying, because I'm not going to be flattered by that strong language. They're trying to bridge that gap of saying that by choosing not to be an organ donor, you're choosing to kill somebody. I don't see the equivalent there. By me deciding not to donate to a nonprofit organization in Africa isn't me deciding to kill a child. We just understand that. I don't really think that I need to explain that philosophically. We just intuitively understand that, okay? And so that's what I'm trying to point out, and that is exactly what I think this debate comes down to. Okay, that's kind of what I wanted to get around to. So thank you, Tim. It is the point that how far are we willing to go? And it's just not fair to ask this question of, well, because in my opinion, you could look at anything that we do and you could say, hey, you could have spent $10 less on that shirt. Why did you do that? You could have given that to the poor. Why did you walk by that homeless person who was starving on the street and not drop a quarter in his glass? He could have bought lunch with that. There's all kinds of questions. And how far are we going to let the government go in impeding on our rights and obligating us to give to things just because the end goal is human life? I just don't see that. I don't see them bridging that gap. And to be quite honest, for them to win this debate, they have to bridge that gap. And my partner and I think, have come up here and given you plenty of reasons why this motion is simply a violation of our right to decide what we want to do with our property. We've given you examples of why the points that they've brought up have plenty of holes in them. And we've shown you how this is simply an un-American resolution. And we just believe that by giving the government this power, what else are we giving them? That's my question for you, and that's what I want you to think about when deciding on this motion today. Thank you very much.
Because Tim and I believe that human life is the highest end and that you have obligation to save human life, we think we should win today's debate round. What I'm going to be doing is going over 3 questions, 3 main reasons why I think we won this round. The first question, is human life the highest end? The second question is, do you have obligation to save human life? And third of all, does the government team save more lives? So with the first question, is human life the highest end? The opposition says that, well, there are ends that can be higher. So the end of individual individual choice or is higher, that we value people's choice and their bodily autonomy. Now, I personally have never been really persuaded by the right to own one's body outweighing the right to human life, but I have some more reasons beyond that. The first reason we contend is that life is better than choice. Why? Well, we think that laws in general limit liberty for the sake of life. We have this in very basic laws, whether that be speeding laws or seat belts. We could have laws like that with abortion. We have laws like that with murder and homicide, etc. The premise exists already that we limit liberty and choice for the sake of life. So why, more philosophically though, why is life better than choice? Tim and I, we contend that life is better than choice because more people living means more people being able to make choices, to live, to have that right to choose in the first place. Without life is the first value that we must look to. Second of all, though, we say life is the purpose of all endeavors. Like government policy, money, food, all these exist to make life better. Life is the highest end. This wasn't really addressed. Thirdly, we just think like it's the greatest gifts humanity ever has, like one of the greatest gifts God ever gave us. So when we're talking about that life is the highest end, who best helps life? So the opposition team proposed the idea that our policy is definitely un-American. And what we would contend, though, is that life is certainly a higher end than simply being pro-American, right? Beyond that, though, we would say, first of all, that the America I know is America that values life, that begins with life before liberty and the pursuit of happiness, that has life enshrined in its Constitution, or Declaration of Independence. Don't worry, I won't mess up an APTAP. Second of all, though, we would contend that simply just being un-American, like Tim pointed out, is not a reason in of itself. If we live in America that doesn't value life, maybe we will become a better America if we start valuing life. That's what we are proposed. The second question we'd like to contend with, though, is now that we know life is the highest end, do you have an obligation to save human life? We would say the answer is yes. Now, opposition says, well, that's not always true. They say that, first of all, this could lead to a dangerous government precedent, that we just start giving up our liberties for the sake of whatever the government wills. So we would contend, though, that, first of all, the precedent of giving up liberties to the government already exists, so this harm is non-unique. Second of all, though, we would say that we do not have to defend the slippery slope of government overreach in order to warrant your ballot. I'm okay with having the precedent that we can give up liberty for preserving life. I'm okay with living with that precedent. And if that's the worst harm we get from side opposition, I don't really think that's that bad of a world that we're living in. Then they talk about the idea of these religious harms. I think Tim addressed this in his speech, that we already do violate some religious liberty for the sake of preserving human life and human dignity. We see this that we don't allow things like honor killings, that we see in forms of Sharia law. We're willing to compromise religious liberty for the sake of life. Then they bring up the idea that without choice, because it's compulsory, you really don't have that element of love that you need for this to be virtuous. Two responses against this. For our first response is that we simply think that love comes from saving another human life, whether it's compulsory or not, just having more human beings. That's a very loving thing to do. Second of all, though, what we would contend is that even if this choice is not made without love, I will prefer a world where there are more people living, even if a few people are just so self-centered they didn't make that choice with love. I think they'll find the love through their actions. And I just really don't think this outweighs the harms we presented. Why do you have an obligation, though, to protect life? Well, we think there are three reasons for this. First of all, the legal precedent, which I already talked about in my first speech, of giving up liberties for the sake of life and sacrificing even your own money and putting yourself at risk for the sake of life. This wasn't really addressed. Secondly, though, for the reason that the dead do not matter more than the living. We saw this, that organ donation, it does not cause physical pain. You're not hurting anyone through this. This isn't desecrating a body like grave digging or necrophilia. I mean, that's like ew, right? Like, no. Saving human life is a lot different. Organ donation is significantly different. Third of all, though, we would say that even with these examples, this simply just does not outweigh. Having more people on Earth living outweighs against the little bit of harm that comes through going through this medical procedure. We're more concerned with the living. Thirdly and finally, though, we say you have an obligation to your human dignity, to your fellow humans. That we demand that we're okay demanding that people sacrifice something to help others if you can if you can save a life. If we can prevent somebody else from dying, I'm okay with sacrificing liberty, and I think that we all should be okay with that. These are, I think, even ideas that America is built on. The idea that, like, that I am my brother's keeper, I am my sister's keeper, I won't let anyone die on my watch, I won't leave anyone behind. These are values that make our nation work, and I don't think this is counterintuitive to America. Thirdly, and finally, with our final question, though, does the government team save more lives? I think the answer is yes. Opposition's counter-proposal was this idea of advertising. Currently, we have, like, advertising. We do have, in America, and this, like, isn't a job for Don Draper, right? Like, at the point at which there's only 20% participation rate, advertising isn't working. But we're seeing that our plan does work. It does work in Finland, where we saw a 60% increase in transplant operations. We see that it does help the poor because it gives more access, because when you have fewer organs, they simply cost more. So if you're a poor person, you're just out of luck if you need a transplant, and poor people get sick too. They often get sick a lot more. Thirdly, though, we see that ultimately that we do save lives. We're not so sure. They might not use every organ. We're not going to save every life, but we will save some lives. And each life that we save is a reason to be voting for the government team. Maybe we'll get to a point that only one person will die after because they don't get an organ every 60 minutes rather than every 14. Then maybe it'll be only one every day. Maybe it'll be only one every year. But we will be making substantial increases. As it stands in this round, we see the vast advantages of saving lives. People who need organs, they need lungs, they need hearts, they need kidneys, the very things you need to live, and they're waiting for them, and we give them that benefit. In the end, Mr. Speaker, this isn't an issue for tomorrow. This isn't an issue for advertising. Now is always the time to do what is right, as Dr. King said. Now we always have an obligation to help those in need. I'm willing to sacrifice a bit of liberty to save humanity. I'm willing to compromise personal choice for the dignity of human beings. We will eat all of those harms that they have because we think we create a better world. We think ultimately we create an even more American America, where no one's left behind and where humans all have value. Thank you.